The winter of 1939 was like no other in Northern Europe. The forests of Finland stood cloaked in silence, heavy with snow, and yet, behind this frozen stillness, history prepared to erupt. This was the stage for a war many believed would be over in days of war, where a vast empire sought to crush a small nation. Instead, the world watched in astonishment as the people of Finland, against all odds, stood their ground. This is the story of the Winter War, where frost and fire met on Europe's northern frontier. Finland's fate was shaped by its geography. A land of endless lakes and forests, it sat in the shadow of the Soviet Union, sharing a frontier that stretched over 1,200 kilometers. For Moscow, this border was not just a line on a map, it was a threat. St. Petersburg, then known as Leningrad, lonely 32 kilometers from the Finnish border. For Stalin and his generals, this proximity was intolerable. They demanded land, military bases, and assurances of Finnish subsistence. Helsinki refused. In their stubborn independence, the Finns believed neutrality would shield them. But Stalin had already made his move. In August 1939, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact divided Eastern Europe between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. While Hitler prepared to strike Poland, Stalin turned his gaze north. On November 26, 1939, the Soviets staged a border incident at Manila, claiming Finnish shells had killed Soviet troops. It was a fabrication. 3 days later, the Red Army crossed the border with more than 450,000 men, 2,000 tanks, and over 1,000 aircraft. Stalin's aim was simple: the rapid occupation of Finland, the toppling of its government, and its incorporation into the Soviet sphere. The world expected Finland to collapse. How could a nation of barely 3.7 million resist the largest army in the world? But the Soviets had underestimated their opponent. Finland's army was smaller, around 300,000 men, but it was hardened, motivated, and fighting on home ground. The bitter cold became their ally. Temperatures plunged to -40 degrees Celsius. Soviet troops, poorly clothed and undertrained for winter warfare, froze in trenches. Vehicles stalled. Weapons jammed. And then the Finns struck. This was not conventional warfare. Finnish soldiers, clad in white camouflage, seemed to emerge from the snow itself. They skied silently across frozen lakes and dense forests, striking Soviet convoys with sudden ferocity before vanishing into the trees. They cut supply lines, ambushed columns, and encircled divisions. It was here that the world learned a new word, Marty, the Finnish tactic of dividing enemy forces into isolated pockets and destroying them one by one. Et Suomussalmi, to entire Soviet divisions, more than 40,000 men, were annihilated by a Finnish force barely a quarter of their size. Burned-out tanks and frozen corpses marked the white wilderness. Amid these battles emerged legends. One was Simo Hege, the White Death, a Finnish sniper who, armed with nothing more than an iron-sighted rifle, claimed over 500 kills during the war. Soviet soldiers whispered his name in fear, knowing death could come from the stillness of the forest. His story became a symbol of Finnish resilience, one man defying an empire. Yet, for all their courage, Finland could not escape the reality of numbers. The Soviet war machine was vast, and Stalin was relentless. In December, Marshal Kliment Voroshilov was replaced by the ruthless Semyon Timoshenko, who reorganized Soviet forces and prepared a massive offensive against the Mannerheim line, the fortified barrier that shielded Finland's Karelian isthmus. Here, in the frozen earthworks and bunkers, The Finns fought with grim determination. Soviet tanks rolled forward, but Finns with Molotov cocktails, named after Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov, turned armored columns into flaming wrecks. "We are giving Molotov cocktails to go with his food parcels," Finnish soldiers joked darkly, mocking the Soviet claim that their bombs were humanitarian aid. By February 1940, the Soviets adjusted their tactics. They concentrated overwhelming artillery, brought in fresh divisions, and battered the Finnish lines relentlessly. The sky thundered with bombardments. The ground shook under tank assaults. The Finns resisted with every weapon they had, but their ranks were thinning. Ammunition was dwindling, and exhaustion gnawed at the defenders. At last, the Mannerheim line began to break. Diplomacy could no longer be delayed. Finland appealed desperately to Britain, France, and Sweden for aid. Volunteers and supplies trickled in, but the Western powers were distracted by the larger storm brewing with Germany. Alone and facing annihilation, Finland chose survival over destruction. On March 13, 1940, the Winter War ended with the Treaty of Moscow. The cost was immense. Finland ceded 11% of its territory, including the Karelian Isthmus, Salla, and Ladoga. Over 400,000 Finns were forced to abandon their homes and resettle elsewhere. Yet Finland retained its sovereignty. The Red Army had bled heavily, over 120,000 dead. Some estimates far higher, while Finnish losses stood at around 25,000. The Soviets had won land, but at a price that exposed their weaknesses to the world. Hitler, watching closely, took note. The poor performance of the Red Army in Finland emboldened his belief that the Soviet Union could be conquered. Less than 2 years later, Operation Barbarossa would put that assumption to the test. For Finland, the Winter War was both tragedy and triumph. They had lost territory but preserved independence. Their reputation soared worldwide. In Britain and America, newspapers hailed the brave little nation. Winston Churchill praised the Finns, saying, "Only Finland superb, nay sublime in the jaws of peril, has maintained her freedom, her independence, and her honor." For Stalin, it was a bitter lesson. Victory had been secured, but it had been costly, humiliating, and slow. The legacy of the Winter War echoes even today. It became a story of defiance, a small nation standing against overwhelming odds. It showed the world the power of unity, terrain, and spirit over sheer numbers. It was a reminder that courage can carve a place in history, even against the greatest of empires. As the snow melted, in 1940, Finland was battered but unbroken. Yet, their struggle with the Soviet Union was not over. Within a year, they would be drawn again into conflict, this time alongside Nazi Germany, in the continuation war. But the memory of that first frozen resistance, the Winter War, remains etched in Finnish identity, a symbol of national pride and endurance. This has been Soviet attack on Finland. Winter War 1939-40. Every detail you've heard reflects the sacrifice of those who endured one of the harshest conflicts of modern history. Bringing such stories to life requires immense effort, researching archives, consulting historical accounts, and giving voice to the past. If you value high-quality, historical storytelling, consider supporting the work that keeps history alive, so that the courage of those who came before us is never forgotten.